into our first session, which is called Risk and Reputation in the Activist Era. At a time of increasing crises and issues management, corporates are being called on to take a stand, often in difficult geopolitical or activist contexts. What we want to do on this panel is examine whether staying silent is still an option and how communication strategies are evolving in light of this activist era. I'd like to introduce our panelists. Furthest to my right is Lenovo Asia Pacific Head of Communications, Geneviève Hilton. Next to Geneviève is Penny Davis, who's Bupa Brand, Customer and Corporate Affairs Director. And next to me is Charles Lancaster, who's EVP of Global Reputation and Risk at Rudafin. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Let's start with an easy question. Actually, it's not an easy question, but let's start with it.
I don't believe you.
Let's start with it anyway. So we have seen, as I mentioned, increasing activism. We've seen companies being called on to make their views explicit on sensitive issues that are perhaps supported in some countries but not in other countries. Sometimes political issues. For example, in the US, we've seen companies taking a stand on voting rights. We've seen companies being asked about their supply chains in this part of the world. These all bring implications. So my first question is, when confronted with these kinds of forces, have we reached a point now where it's more of a risk to stay silent versus speaking up? And Geneviève, I appreciate you've only just arrived at the venue, but I'd still like to start with you, if that's okay.
Sure, thanks very much, Arun. So you asked about whether it's, you put it in the frame of being silent or speaking out. And I'm not sure that's even the right frame to put it in, because on what occasion has being completely silent ever helped a company? I don't think any occasion. It's rather that it's a process that happens much longer before the issue ever grows to that. The issue ever gets to that point of, understanding the materiality of the issue, having dialogue with stakeholders, and then getting at some point to understand how does this impact us? What are the expectations of the stakeholders? Have we addressed them? And then when the issue actually comes up in the public consciousness, being ready and saying like, yeah, this is our stand, and we've done all the homework. Here's our position. And in particular, I wanted to mention the topic of materiality. I changed industries quite dramatically about 2.5 years ago from the chemical industry to the technology industry. Issues are different. The materiality of what the stakeholders of the chemical industry are interested in, things like production safety and transportation safety. Technology industry, things like data privacy and educational infrastructure. So if you don't take the time to understand all those issues and do the analysis and have the stakeholder dialogue, then you can get caught out by the time the issue is raised. And do I stay silent? Then you're like, there's a lot of lights here, so like the deer in the headlights.
Indeed. Thank you for that. So it's not quite the binary choice that the headline writers might like. Okay, Penny, over to you. Do you feel perhaps there is too much reticence still in terms of companies taking a stand, or do you think that it's justified?
I definitely think that it is about materiality and relevance. So I think in some instances, it is really about relevance to your staff, to your customers, to your stakeholders, and to your industry. So, when you are a global company in particular, so for us at Bupa, Lenovo, and other companies, what is relevant and material in one location is not always material and relevant in others. So it is really important that the context is taken into account. So what is important to your employees in one country around gender and inclusivity, it might be around race, maybe those don't apply in another location. And so I think you need to have those rather sophisticated conversations, not just in your local market, but regionally and then globally as well.
Okay. So I'll come back to that point in a little bit, because I think that's a really crucial one in terms of trying to manage multiple stakeholders and multiple views. But before that, Charles, what's your take on this question. Is
Sure.
staying silent more risky now than speaking up?
I think it is, but I think my colleagues have made some really interesting points. What we tend to advise clients now is think like your potential opponent. So, for example, think like an activist, think like a short seller. So, just as the trend is really coming very clear here, which is before you get to that binary moment where you get a phone call from someone you wouldn't necessarily want to speak to, try to have the playbook written in advance for these scenarios. It's very unusual for something to come out of the blue. We find that time and time again. I mean, I think the term crisis is hugely overused. It's typically something that's been visible for many months. So wherever possible, think like an activist. And one thing we always recommend is in any organization, task, I mean, the software folks do this all the time, black hat, white hat, task a really smart group of your executives to actually try to damage the company. Be it from an environmental way, be it from an IT way, be it from a reputational way. And you'll be quite amazed at the value that comes out of that exercise.
Okay, so think like an activist. Penny, let's come back to the point that you made. It raises some really interesting questions for the whole panel. You talked about determining what matters to your stakeholders, whether that's presumably your employees, your customers, it could be regulators, it could be NGOs. But what if it's completely different depending on what they care about? I mean, that could depend on where they're based. We've seen some issues matter more to people in some countries than they do to others. We've seen that often they're at loggerheads, right? You could take a stance on one issue and it could annoy people in another country. I don't want to name any names, but how do you manage that kind of situation? So this is a question I'll ask for all of you. And it does perhaps get to this idea of can corporates really please all of their stakeholders all the time?
So I think it really comes down to, as an organization, are you purpose-led, and do you use that purpose to define what you take a position on, how you choose to act in a certain situation? And if you are true to that, there is an authenticity about it that your staff firstly are going to believe and buy into, and your customers and your stakeholders, whether they're regulators or whether they're other bodies. So for us, I think that's really important, that we come back to what is our purpose, what are we in the business of doing. For me, I work at Bupa, we're in the business of healthcare, and we have 85,000 employees around the world, most of who are frontline. So they bring a diverse range of views and opinions, but fundamentally for us, it's really important that we are universally focused on healthcare and our people. And so those are the issues that we would choose to engage in. And we think taking a leadership position on some of them is really important. So some examples are things around inclusivity. That means different things in various locations, as I said before. In Australia and New Zealand, we're very focused on inclusivity of our Indigenous people, so our Aboriginal communities, and recognising the people that are working in our business or are our customers is really important there. In the UK, we have a large business where inclusivity and discussions around race and Black Lives Matter came from the US, and so it was really important to have that conversation there. But it plays out in different ways. I don't think we can pretend that you can have, and certainly as comms professionals, we don't deliver the same message in the exact same way in every market, let alone in every channel. So that nuance is really important. I think a challenge that probably some of us have internally is getting all our colleagues to understand that, who are not perhaps in our function, and getting sometimes attention on that when there's the day-to-day running of the business can be challenging. I'm sure you've got those experiences too.
I'm going to try to put in a little bit of a more blunt way than you just put it. If you can take a stand on something without being a jerk about it.
Yeah.
And that nuance is exactly what the communications professionals are there to help the management do. Something you mentioned a minute ago, when there might be two groups of stakeholders who are loggerheads with each other and cannot agree. We've actually found sometimes that it helps to get them together to talk. So, for example, we had an issue a few years ago about the camera on the laptop, and one group, which was kind of like the banks, were saying we don't want cameras on the laptop because we're worried about data privacy. And the other group, which was, for example, the gamers, and said, no, we have to have a camera. And because we had this thing called the Customer Experience Insights Panel, wonderful name for a group of customers that we keep up and talking together, and they came up with a solution which became the Think Shutter, which is the physical shutter that goes across the camera on the laptop, and basically they figured that out together. So it was very much a basis on the basis of having that dialogue starting and then actually getting them to talk to each other.
Okay, interesting point. So stick to your principles, find the issues that matter, and perhaps even be a force for collaboration amongst warring stakeholders. Charles, how do you see it? Do you find when you're advising clients on this that they are going to have to get more comfortable alienating people or not?
I don't think it's a question of alienation. I like that point about you don't have to be a jerk about it. I'm going to just use a very domestic example, which is my firm, Rue de Fin. And this is very, very local, but every year we have mooncakes in Hong Kong. And let's be quite blunt, none of us love the mooncake arrival, I think it's fair to say. I mean, I think amongst... No, it's a bit of a statement.
Don't get cancelled, Charles.
It's a bit of a statement. But so we consulted my team and they said, look, we would actually rather not give out mooncakes. There's a favorite charity that we've got in Hong Kong, which is a wonderful show. And by the way, this is nothing against the mooncake industry, right? If that's your thing, I love you. But my colleagues made the choice, and it was an open it was a completely open conversation, and it's a micro basis, but it was real engagement. We asked a question: we normally spend this amount of dollars on mooncakes. Where would you like us to spend it in a different place? And we collectively figured out 2 charities. So I think at a very, very micro basis, that's kind of the way things are going, which is it can be collaborative, but I think there has to be engagement. But I think that when you look at, there was a recent Deloitte survey that said 72% of employees now look at purpose as importantly as pretty much everything else about their job. I think it's something that isn't going away anytime soon.
Okay. Geneviève, let me come back to you because you talked about managing 2 different groups of stakeholders. But as a multinational corporation, how difficult a position do you find yourselves in around specific issues that perhaps give rise to certain expectations in one country and another set of expectations in another? How do you thread that needle?
Well, I mean, that's the art of communications. That's why we, pay people like us to do this job, is to figure out how to do that. But yeah, I mean, we're like Lenovo is, I would say, even unusually multinational. I mean, we have 4 business groups, and the business group leaders, like one of them's Italian, one's American. Like one sits in Italy, one sits in America, one sits in Brazil, and one sits in Hong Kong. You cannot find a place and say like, oh, this opinion in this market matters more than others. So yeah, there are things like, what do you show? How do you show the borders on maps in the corporate guidelines? And sometimes you have to make decisions. Like I said, no maps. No, I said no, absolutely no maps anywhere. Because no matter what border you put on that map, you're going to make somebody unhappy about it. So even we're showing a PowerPoint presentation, no maps. There are other areas where you can't avoid an issue entirely, but you can certainly talk about it. You can make sure that everyone knows it's an issue and that this isn't something that, that's not the hill that we're going to die on. And the network of communicators and the communications governance process that goes into that helps a lot. So just maybe one example, we have as part of the overall diversity and inclusion, we have this thing called an inclusive marketing guideline. And this was set out kind of a policy from the global team. And to be perfectly frank, not everybody in the world cares as much about inclusivity in marketing as everybody else does. But when there was, what it meant was that when there was a kind of a rogue social media manager who wanted to post this really kind of tasteless advertisement of a person holding a Lenovo device who was like shapely female and only shown from here to here, it gave us the basis, because we had this guideline, to shut it down and say, no, don't use this ad because it doesn't follow the guidance. And so that, and that person in that market might have otherwise said like, well, we don't care about this. This isn't an issue here. But because we had the guidance, we discussed it in advance, it helps a lot. So that process of governance, I think, is really important.
Okay, so from mooncakes to maps. Penny, how do you find yourself dealing with uncomfortable issues? Do you find that it's a challenge when trying to get senior leadership all on the same page in terms of tackling some of these?
Yeah, so I think one of our big jobs, certainly sort of in-house, is to raise the profile and importance of reputation risk management in general. So depending on the other people around the table, they may be very alert and aware to it as individuals or because of their previous experience in other companies. I mean, if you have a CEO who's been through a massive crisis before, they are going to love what you have to say and be willing to support you in the preparation and preparing, as Charles said earlier, preparing before an issue occurs and thinking positions through. If you don't, I think a lot of the time of people like us is spent trying to raise the profile around the importance of taking a stand. And I love what Charles said about thinking like an activist, because part of this is bringing it back to the commercial. So if you're not taking a position on an issue that is considered relevant to your staff or your customers, then probably one of your competitors is, and they're preparing for it pretty quickly, and it might become a commercial advantage for them. So I think part of that discussion is really important, not just constantly talking about what could go wrong, it's also what could go right.
Yeah.
It's this idea, let's explore that a little bit, this idea of thinking like an activist. Does this mean, for example, that the communicator should be representing the outside world almost, playing a role as almost the conscience of the organization? Charles, what's your take on that?
100%. The outside world is, I think, exceptionally important to any organization. And we encourage our clients, and as much as possible, we do it for ourselves as well. It's just it's that famous expression, scenario planning, which is frankly a little bit, I think, a bit old school. So what we try to do is put what we call dynamic sort of environment creation. So in other words, we look at what we're doing, we look at what could go wrong. And I think what Penny said is really interesting. If you have a management team that has never been through a really big problem, they're far more reticent in this sort of exercise than an organization that has been. And I think this is what we see as a big sort of philosophical difference. I mean, we have certain organizations who literally once a year, in the old days when we could fly, now we do it here, they put everyone through a test. And these tend to be the companies that have had a really terrible experience, either product recall, management change, share price collapse, etc. And I won't say it's a sad thing, but it's a reality that companies haven't been through that tend not to put such a focus on it until such point as they need to, and then they do.
Geneviève, what's your take on it? Does it require a crisis to get to that role as the conscience?
Well, it doesn't hurt. And I think there's an expression somewhere like, don't let a crisis go to waste.
Yeah.
So when there is one, that's the moment when the communicator has to, I don't want to say take advantage, but take the opportunity to look at what are the processes that allow this to happen to begin with. But a minute ago, you said the word conscience. So the communicator's role is absolutely 100% to represent the views of the outside world and the employees too, by the way, very important group of stakeholders, and to reflect those, summarize those with data, with charts and graphs and with examples saying like, hey, look what happened to your buddy that you spoke on the panel at the industry forum last year. Look what happened to him. Do you want this to happen to you? If not, then let's go through this process. But the question of being the conscience, I think, is a little bit of a different question. It's what Penny mentioned earlier. Are you a purpose-driven organization? Maybe, maybe not. But is it the role of the communicator to be the moral compass of the CEO? And I'm not 100% sure that can be the case if the management group doesn't have a moral compass to begin with. And I would even go so far as to say that that's that may sometimes border on a gendered topic, because the communicators are more women than men. And there's an old trope about the angel of the house keeping everybody else in line, with the woman and the man in the group. So I'm a little bit careful. On one hand, I'm going to say, yes, absolutely, we're the conscience and the driving force for good in our organizations, but without wanting to say, no, only the communicator can be the conscience.
Yeah, right. It's a really good point. Penny, what are your thoughts on that question in terms of the communicator being the conscience of the organization?
I think, and probably having a go at Charles in his line of work, it's easy for someone on the outside to say that to those people who are sitting around the table, but we're also there to solve problems. And we're there as much as part of the management team. And when a decision's made, whether it's in line with our personal or our company, what we perceive to be the company's kind of moral compass or not, our job is then to work out how you deliver that message, in the best possible way for the best possible impact from the company. So it's tough, but I certainly think that probably the best performing sort of corporate affairs type functions internally are the ones that point out all the impacts and size it, and I think show the material impact. And I love the example of pointing out, what peers in the industry have gone through as well. I think the obvious statement, though, is that no business is untouched now by COVID. So there is absolutely every business, every industry has gone through what we'd term some sort of crisis and has been impacted in some way. The interesting thing will be how businesses learn from this. And I also think how fast they are to focus on all the other issues going on around us. So I think it's never been more true. And we're talking about, issues and taking stands. The last 2 years alone, we've seen huge developments at really fast pace, and some companies are keeping up and taking stands on these issues and making changes internally, and some aren't. Some are still focusing on the impacts of COVID. And so I think it will be very interesting, and we'll see some quite clear, what I call winners out of who responds the best and the fastest.
Yeah, it does feel like expectations have changed because of COVID. That's a really good point. Let me ask you about the idea of an activist CEO, because that's something we're seeing more of now. Again, I think we're seeing more of it in Western markets, frankly. But the question is whether we will see more of it in Asia, whether we need to see more of it, whether you expect it, or whether it's too risky. Charles, let me start with you.
Sure. I mean, I did a bit of homework for this session, and it was fascinating. Some of the takeaways were, the organization often can define its own activism and own position. And the example given was Ben & Jerry's, the ice cream company, which is very, very well known for having very strong beliefs. But the one that I found really fascinating was Patagonia. Full disclosure, not a client of ours, but as someone who's always been watching the environmental argument, I think it's fair to say if anyone is not in full belief that we are facing an environmental catastrophe, you're not looking in the right direction. And so Patagonia, almost their time has come, because they have been an activist company on the environment, often a voice in the wilderness, excuse the pun, right? But today, there can be no question that this is something we are all facing. And I think choose your battles. But they were consistent from the get-go. We're all about nature. We're all about outdoors. We're all about the environment. And I think as a company point of view, this will now resonate even stronger because of the authenticity of it, because this is what they've meant. That's what they've done all the time. So I can see more and more of this coming.
Interesting. And I'll come back to Patagonia. There's an interesting point there as well. Geneviève, what's your take on the idea of an activist CEO? Do you think it's wise?
So a couple of points on that. Number one is back to my original comment, which was the materiality question. So I think it's very hard for a CEO to be an activist in a sphere that is like totally unrelated to the business. So I mean, I can't think of an example, but
Well, so Salesforce and gun control.
Do they have an activist CEO? Okay. Well, then if it becomes much more of a personal topic for the CEO. And that comes to my second point, which is should your CEO be activist? Let's say we conclude that the answer is yes. Can I then go to my CEO and make him into an activist? Almost certainly not. I think it's almost, for a communicator, the question is, okay, is your CEO an activist? If so, then how do you deal with it? And if your CEO is not an activist, I don't think there's any opportunity. I don't think there's any chance of saying, like, okay, making her or him into an activist.
Right. So it kind of has to be a personal position.
Yeah, and it often, very often does. I remember quite a few years ago attending a conference here in Hong Kong where the CEO was talking about how he had put the whole company through this, green growth process. And someone asked, like, why did you do it? And he said, well, it was when my 6-year-old son came back from P1 with this little bean plant. And he thought about, like, that bean plant is so precious and my 6-year-old son is so precious, and where will he be in 20 years' time? And then he thought about the world and the environment, and he decided to do it in his company. Like, that's not something that the communications person could have convinced him. It's only the sun and the bean plant that could have done it.
Yeah. Penny, what's your take? Is there a risk that maybe a personal stance could clash with what's good for the business?
Definitely, but I think probably most people that get to the role of CEO know how to manage that before they get there. I think it's also about, it's so I come from a marketing background. I think it comes to brands as well. So it's not just the, personality and the appetite that the CEO has to take on that role. We all know that, some leaders, some executives are more comfortable and keen on media exposure than others. And you take that to taking a stand takes it to the next level. But it's about the individual's personal brand with the brand of the company. So, some CEOs are rock stars that come in to a new company and you already know what they stand for. So in advance you're going to have to deal with that and plan for it, and how does that weave into the narrative? And usually the board already has a view on that. I come from Australia, where we have a couple of pretty standout activist CEOs. So Alan Joyce, who's the CEO of Qantas, is very well known for that, and he has taken a number of personal positions and is viewed as being a real leader of the business community in terms of businesses taking a position on issues. And I think that's been really successful for Qantas. But, competing airlines haven't had that same role, and that's partly because the leaders have chosen not to be, or they're not that personality, or it's more about the brand and the company. So I think Charles talked about legacy, and if you have CEOs moving on as well, that's a real risk. So if you're building a company, Patagonia, the founders are very well known, but they haven't gone on to then be rock star CEOs of other companies or in completely unrelated industries. Their identity is caught up in that. And I think that's really important. Coming back to authenticity, though, so, we have 3 values internally, so brave, responsible, and caring. I think you need a brave CEO to take that on and to make that leap. You need a brave team to support him as well. You need someone that's caring and authentic about a message, and someone that feels responsibility in both a position of influence, but also a company and a brand that has a position of influence.
Okay. Coming back to Patagonia, Charles, because you brought them up, and Penny, you talked about them as well. If I'm not mistaken, I don't know if they gave back their Trump tax break or they donated it because they did not. I suspect they did not want to be seen to be benefiting from an administration with which they disagreed so profoundly. It raises the question about whether companies should be willing to sacrifice profits in pursuit of their principles. So is that too simplistic a choice? Geneviève, I'll start with you.
If you're going to be an activist or take a stance on something, then you better be able to put your money where your mouth is. I mean, that seems very obvious. And whatever the issue is, you have to look at your own internal processes first. If you want to be an activist on diversity and inclusion, look to your own house first. See how are you managing things. If you want to be an activist on the environment, well, you probably better not be spewing a wastewater stream out the back door. So to me, that seems perfectly consistent. If you then take that to what degree do you do symbolic gestures and then make a big deal out of them? Yeah, then that's a little bit the art of the communicator to say, is the timing exactly right? Do we think we have a friendly journalist who will cover this the way we want to? Do we think the employees are ready to hear this message? Is this going to be more trouble than it's worth? Then again, that's the communicator's art, to figure out all those questions and decide how to talk about it. Or maybe keep it quiet and let somebody discover it, and then it becomes an internet meme.
Penny, do you find that that's an issue? Principles are all well and good until they rub up to the the harsh realities of making money, especially perhaps in a climate where it hasn't been that easy to grow.
Yeah, I think without a doubt, you do have to have your own house in order first. And I also think, your question, Arun, goes to, again, this theme of authenticity. So everyone will see, I mean journalists, stakeholders, customers, memes on the internet will see through you if you make claims that, you just aren't living in practice. So, if I take a theme recently like mental health. So we know, the mental health effect of COVID and the restrictions has been significant. I think that we've seen a lot of companies in Hong Kong and in other markets talk about it, do beautiful ad campaigns, and perhaps if you were to go and ask their staff what the business is doing for them, it might not be that generous and it might not be that real. So, for us, we've probably been on the conservative side and haven't stepped out and talked about what we do. But that is because, we know that we have to be walking the talk first. And that means training our staff with mental health first aid, all our people managers. It means, having EAP support lines. It means having wellness checks for people. And that's all really important before you take a position. All it takes is one disgruntled employee to make an anonymous phone call, and it all comes falling down. So I think we see that happen in a lot of other markets. I don't think we see that happen in Hong Kong so much, but I think it's going to be more and more likely.
Charles, is it something you see much of, that this tension between purpose and profit? And which way do you see?
I'm going to approach it a slightly different way. I see that if companies want their equity to now be attractive as an investment to sort of institutional investors, you now have to have so many, I would say, there's a lot of boxes you need to tick from the ESG lens. And before you can then say, this is the way we run our business, if you're not in that club, in many cases, you're not considered a viable investment by an awful lot of institutional investors. So it's less, I think, profit purpose, but that's very important. I think it's more, is our company fit for purpose as far as the institutional investors are concerned? And if we don't want to be in that box, that's okay. But most large corporates want to be seen as a trusted, valuable member of the community, which then gives them license to be considered as a key part of any portfolio. So I think that's a trend we've seen is absolutely huge at the moment.
So it will cost them more
if you're
in
not
the
in
long
that,
run.
If you're not in that club, you're not in that club.
Okay. So we have around 15 minutes left, and obviously if there's any questions from anyone, please feel free to put your hand up. That goes for all of you watching virtually. If you have questions, please feel free to comment, and the questions will find their way to me. If there are any questions in the room, let me know. Otherwise, I will keep going. No, none yet. Okay.
There must be one question.
There will be.
Anything you've ever wanted to ask a PR
there we
guy,
go.
now's your chance.
Mark, please.
Thanks. Mark Michaels. Thank you for this. I saw Activist Era, and it has been fairly activist in Hong Kong for the past few years or so. I wonder if you talk about that. I mean, not only what's happened geopolitically, but obviously in 2019, which seems ages ago. Just one example, and there was more than one example, but for example, a well-known brand was advertising on one of the major media outlets here, and withdrew its advertising. Withdrew its advertising in the middle of the year of 2019. It's because their contract expired. They didn't intend to. But because that advertising, the broadcast media outlet was considered pro-government, all the anti-government people praised them, and then they were perhaps told by their consultant to issue a statement, basically pretty benign, talking about one country, two systems, and then the other way it turned. And those were all key market segments for them. Not just that as an example, but what happens when this happens? And it's happened a lot in Hong Kong and China lately, with
Yeah,
the
and
political and geopolitical.
been many, many examples, I think, of companies in Hong Kong who found themselves ensnared in these issues. Who wants to take that one?
I'll take a shot. We had, when we do crisis readiness workshops, one of the things which we always say that you should do is write up on the whiteboard, back when they were in real life, I remember this time, write up on the whiteboard, what is the objective of the team? And so maybe the objective is get out of this alive, or maybe the objective is, public safety, for example. And with that objective in mind, I think it will help a lot to figure out, to what degree do you just have to sit there and suffer a little bit while this whole thing happens around you, and how not to make it worse by some action that you took. And so, for example, during 2019, I know that a lot of companies wanted to make sure that said, out of everything else, we want to make sure that the employees are okay. And so that was objective number one. So did the employees feel their physical safety was in danger? Did they feel that their personal, their personal privacy, that their ability to take risks, or their ability to speak was in danger? And so if you put that as the forefront, then the rest will fall into place. Maybe another company might say, like, no, our mission here is to respect and focus on our relationship with one government or another. Maybe, I don't know, I'm supposing somewhere that was up on the whiteboard in some companies. Then they might have made a different decision. So it's really figuring out that decision helps to then just sit around and tough it out when some of the bad stuff will just happen. And it's a little bit like a natural disaster sometimes. If the mudslide comes and it wipes out your parking lot or half your building, then you just have to fix it, because it's stuff that's happening around you. But don't make it worse by then doing something irresponsible along with it.
Sure.
Anyone else?
Sure. Before I answer a specific question, I want to show something that, and I've lived in Hong Kong for a while. I won't name the establishment, but if you want to see how things are changing, a very, very traditional Hong Kong establishment. I was trying to find the Wi-Fi the other day, which I found. But to join the Wi-Fi, you had to give up all your details and, where are you located, right? The map thing, right? So you scroll down, Abidjan, Australia, H for Hong Kong. No H for Hong Kong. I went, okay. Scroll up, Chinese Hong Kong. Now, I hadn't seen that before, and I thought that was quite interesting. So this is a direction of travel, clearly. But I think that's the point about, what is the right decision? I think it's often making the least bad choice. And I know that isn't very scientific, but what I will also add to that is we do a lot of analysis when our clients are in difficulty. Never confuse upset social media with intention to buy. Okay. And what I mean by that is we've had a lot of clients who literally are almost in tears because their Facebook's blown up. Everyone hates them. And we say, just hold the line. You've been in business for 25 years. You've got clients that have been buying your product every week. Everyone might be very upset with you, but the trend line, and when you ask the question, do you hate them? I really hate them. Will you still buy their product? Oh yeah, absolutely. So the trend line for intention to buy, and this is consumer goods, hotels, you name it, the trend line for intention to buy is almost unwavering. And we always say to our clients, keep in mind, it'll be very unpleasant for 5 days, but don't lose sight of the mission. You're a trusted organization, you're trying to do the right thing. This is probably a flare. Whatever's happening right now is unlikely to be the same shape 5 days from now. And I think going back to the TVB point, if that's a good answer, I don't know, Mark. I think there's a lot of cases like that where everyone just went ballistic for 48 hours and then everyone forgot about it.
Maybe I can add to that the hometown paper phenomenon. So sometimes the senior management has a particular publication that they read,
There
and
it is.
if there's an article in that publication, then it's the most important thing that ever happened. And if there's no article in that publication, then the thing didn't exist.
Yep.
So I think part of our job as communicators is to make sure we get past that, hometown paper phenomenon and show like here's the statistics here. This is the trend line is of social media is going up, and the trend line of I want to buy the product is going down. If we have that, then we need to show that,
Sure.
and not just it didn't show up in your hometown paper, therefore it's not an issue. Or alternatively, even though it showed up in your hometown paper, everybody still loves the product.
It's the billboard outside the CEO's house. Any more questions? Okay, I will ask another one. Actually, based on kind of building on Mark's question, because so much of what we've seen is being driven now by employees, which certainly seems to be a trend that's accelerated, and also I think through the pandemic has kind of become more noticeable. So I'll start on the corporate side. How do you first of all determine what matters to your employees, and then decide how you're going to respond to that from a corporate perspective? So, Penny,
Yeah.
you look like you want to answer this question.
Well, I love this part. Actually, I think this is the most exciting, the most exciting part, because when stuff is driven by your staff, it very rarely can fail. So you ask them. I think we've touched on that already, but you test things out. So I'll use a local example. So we've globally we're very focused on the environment and sustainability, and we've made a number of commitments globally. But Hong Kong is its own environment and kind of on the start of a bit of a journey compared to some other markets. So we wanted to see how it would resonate with our staff to actually engage them in these sorts of topics, right? So we see Omni Pork on every menu in Hong Kong, but that doesn't necessarily mean our staff are going to, get away from their desks and pick up rubbish on the beach, and actually then also take those ideas into the corporate offices where they're thinking about, reducing waste in our healthcare operations and making decisions around product design. Could we get to that? So we tested it. We kind of engaged them through some behavioural challenges with rewards. We asked people to turn up for volunteer days to see if it resonates. We asked people to join, some different conferences and put their hands up to speak, or to join different employee groups, and it worked. So we know that we have permission to really go hard on that locally and internally, which is fantastic because it's part of our strategy. But you do need to kind of measure and test how employees will respond to it. And I think if you don't have that sense and you don't have that real feel for it, then it usually falls flat and it looks like another great internal campaign, very much virtue signalling. So I think that's really key.
Geneviève?
So ask them is the word you just used a minute ago. So ask is very important, and then put it into the strategic plan. So we have something called Lenovo Listens, it's a global annual survey. I think a lot of companies do something similar. But I have to say, since I joined Lenovo, I never saw a company that takes this as seriously as this company does. There are task forces, there are follow-up sessions, there are guidelines, and it's a big deal. And the all hands call from the Asia Pacific president, he goes through the Lenovo Listens scores in each area and talks about this is mapping to this area of the task force. And then there's like another round of feedback from employees to talk about how they are responding to the topics that are created by the task force. So, I think it's great. And I've really enjoyed observing this process since I joined the company. And it makes it into a management topic and not just a communications topic. So if, as we found, the employees actually really cared about the for example, at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, everybody worked from home. We found they really cared about their home working environment, and they really wanted, like, so is the company going to give me a desk or what? And we do happen to sell and provide a lot of electronic equipment. So we, it's like, does everybody get a ThinkVision monitor? Does everybody get whatever station? So the result is that because of that, it went through this whole Lenovo Listens process, and we ended up with certain systems so where we could have a stipend to buy home equipment and then get discounts on Lenovo gear through the employee purchase program and this whole process. So, and I don't think that would have happened at that speed or at that level of corporate power without that process of of the Lenovo Listens being embedded into the strategy. So it was very interesting to see it in action once it really happened.
Charles, are you seeing your clients are more open to listening to their employees and acting on it?
I think I would just echo everything we've heard. And what's interesting is every organization does it in a slightly different way. So it's top of the agenda. In fact, I cannot recall when we last sort of worked with an organization, so especially in a competitive aspect of the business, as in trying to win the business, where employee comms, or in fact employee engagement, wasn't a key part of that work. So I think it's very high on the agenda because, if that part isn't right, very little else will work effectively, in our opinion. And so we just see that this aspect is critical.
Okay. All right. Well, any more questions? Time for one last question. If not,
There's a box of mooncakes for anyone who offers a quick question for.
You've got extra supply. I see. All right. Well, in that case, I think we'll close our first session, and I will thank
Thank you.
our panelists so much for being our first panelists at our first hybrid event in Hong Kong. So thank you all very much. To those of you watching, we'll be back in a minute or so. You can clap, please. Go
Thank
ahead.
you.
Yeah.